So now we're ready to go and look at purchase order matching. We're going to go to accounts payable and look at all purchase orders. Here we see all our purchase orders at various statuses, and we have an approval status of confirmed, which means it's available for receiving, but it is still an open order. And that means that either some or all of the order is still open. It doesn't mean it is something that we could have a partial receipt, but it means that there's still an open value somewhere on the PO. So we're going to go into the purchase order itself very briefly and show what we have on the purchase order, and we are ordering 100 standard cabinets at this item number to be received in this site and warehouse at this unit price for a total amount of $2,000, 100 at $20 a piece. What I'm going to do on this one is try to invoice it, even though I haven't yet received it, so we can see what error is generated. So I'm going to go into the Invoice tab up at the top, generate an invoice, and we can see no lines came through. So we didn't find anything to show here, shows on the bottom, meaning in other words, there's nothing to invoice. And the reason there's nothing to invoice is we haven't received it yet. And since we're requiring three-way matching, that means this is not going to be possible to process any further. So I'm going to delete this invoice header. And go back to our purchase order lines. On that empty invoice header that we saw, we also had a match status viewable that said the match status failed because there's nothing to match. We're going to see that field after we do receive. And we are going to go and receive against this purchase order right now. So I'm going to go into receiving, go into product receipt. I'm going to enter in a product receipt amount or a product receipt number that I'm just assigning myself. And then I'm going to go in and it's going to say it's going to receive against the order quantity. Receiving is covered in much detail in the trade and logistics courses. And we're just going to click OK to receive this product. And it says operations complete, so now we have a product receipt. And in fact, we can see that there's a product receipt journal that's highlighted and available for us to look at, which confirms it. But now we're going to go in and invoice against that product receipt. So I'm going to click back on that invoice tab, I'm going to click back on generate invoice, and we'll see what it does. And here is then it does bring in our line item, and it did bring in all 100 units, so that was the initial receipt on this with the correct price and line net amount. We have a match status value here which says match status is not performed. So what we can do is let's go to match products receipts up at the top, and we can see that it does match that receipt. So it did check it off and it matched it automatically. And so let's click OK on that if we don't want to make any changes. And we can update our match status then. And it says now the match status is passed. So we have a three-way match at this point. Now if we didn't have any changes at all, and we're going to accept it as is and say, yeah, everything's wonderful, that we've gotten our amounts and it matches the paper invoice that we got from the vendor, we can then process it completely. But what we would have to do before doing that is we do have to give it an invoice number, which is the vendor's invoice number. That is a requirement. So I'm just going to make one up here. I can put in a description. I'll just say cabinets. And I do want to give it an invoice date, which is the physical date on that vendor invoice. So I'll say that was back to August 9th. The posting date is the date that is going to hit the ledger, and the update the invoice in AP which I'm going to leave it today's date, but we can make that a change to that date if we need to. For example, if we're got an invoice after a period was closed. The due date triggers off the terms, and so all of that is going to be taken up when we in the vendor setup course. And if we chose to, we can now post it, but we're not going to do that just yet because I'm going to make some changes on the invoice to show some of the match discrepancies that can come up and how to handle them from on this form. What we're going to do to trigger a discrepancy and see how we can handle that discrepancy is I'm going to change the unit price on the line. If I change this to 21 or less, or to 19, it would be within the 5% tolerance that we had set up. But I'm going to change this to more than that. I'm going to change this to $22. We'll say that the invoice came in as $22, which is different from the price that was on the purchase order. I'm then going to update my match status. Now I can see that my match status has failed, and the reason it's failed is because of that price tolerance. So with a match status of failed, or any status really, we can review what the discrepancy is by going into the Review tab and clicking Matching Details. So in the Matching Details, I can see that my unit price here says $22. I actually can change it here too, if I want to, and it'll change it on the lines. And that my purchase order said $20, and so that's our matching difference is between the price and on the purchase order and the price on the invoice. So we viewed our matching details at the header level. We'll also see that there are matching details at the line level, but we can see also that our match status went back to not performed again. And we might decide that is not something we want to necessarily have to update manually all the time. So I'm going to go back and look back at the parameters that we looked at before to see if there is a way that we can make that automatic. And of course there is. So I'm going to go to Accounts Payable Parameters again, go back to my invoice validation, and this time I'm going to turn on Automatically Update Invoice Header Status. So as it may lead to lower performance during the invoice vendor data entry, but maybe that's going to be a minor consideration. And I think that's an important thing to point out, that there is a number of different things in the parameters that can govern how our invoice matching processing works. And back in the invoice now, just from changing that, we have a match status of failed. So now it is automatically doing the match status update for us, and we can even see that button is gone from the top of the screen. Now you can also look at the match totals on the invoice lines as well, the matching details. And what we see here then is we have the details of our matching differences up here, but we notice it says the match status was not performed. And the reason for that is because that's how we set it up in our parameters to not do that. What we set up to look at was the amount totals on the invoice, and so that would be what has triggered the matching difference and the failure of the match. And so where can we check that? Well, it's not here, and it's not in quantity because we didn't tell it to do that either. I mean, actually the quantity is not different in the first place, but the invoice totals does show it's failed. So those parameters can give you a lot of different types of results depending on how you set them up. In this case, they probably would have failed no matter what we did, because of if we have a 5% tolerance, whether on the price line or on the total, it was still going to be the tolerance. But it gives you an idea that you have a lot of flexibility in how you do your setup of the system and how you want to perform your matching. So this one did fail because of the amount status. The amount of the invoice was over 5% difference from what was on the purchase order. Now we won't be able to process this invoice because we said it required an approval. What we can do is we can put it on hold also to even if it did require, even if it didn't require an approval until somebody comes in, and that's the status invoice status details we have here. Or we can go in and say, no, well, let's do the approval. Could be a different person who does the approving, probably will be in fact. I'm going to go back into the matching details, and in this case we see we do have an approval button here. I'm going to say we're going to approve the poaching with matching discrepancies is what this cut off there, and it's going to show the date and time of the approval, and the approver it's going to add is going to be me. I'm going to be logged in as the approver, and I can put in a comment. I'll just say match approved. And once it's approved, we're now going to be able to post the invoice normally. So we'll post right here. And we have success. It says the vendor invoice posting process is complete for vendor 1001, invoice 4243254. And so now we have our other buttons grayed out here, and our posting is complete. And so we can go back to the purchase order and take a look at the values that we put in on the invoice. Going back into the PO, go to all purchase orders, and we can see on that purchase order it has been invoiced, and we'll be able to see the invoice journal that's been created and anything else that had to do with that invoice, including the GL postings, effects, etc.